A first look at the top of the 2026 rookie class. That's what we're talking about today on Stealing Bananas. I'm Ben Gretch. You can find the Stealing Signals newsletter at bengretch.substack.com. With me, as always, is Shawn Siegele. You can find all of his great work over at RotoViz. Over at Stealing Signals, for me, I'm still working through reactions to the 2025 season. I kind of go on a different timeline this time of year than most analysts who are focused on the rookies and looking forward. I like to really capture as much of my in-season research into my off-season work. So like the weekly Stealing Signals write-ups and everything that I know before that stuff gets a little bit more noisy over the course of an off-season. So I do some like deep dives on veterans and on the macro stuff, and I've been doing all that over at Stealing Signals. So I have not looked at the rookies a lot. Shawn, you've been in the lab with the guys at RotoViz. You guys have the first edition of the RotoViz rookie guide out. You're going to have the second post-combine one coming out soon. You've started to talk about, you had a show with Colin where you guys have talked about combine risers. You'll be doing some more stuff over at RotoViz Overtime. You guys always like to have guests on that help contextualize some of the raw data, which is basically what I just described doing in with the veterans as far as that stuff goes, and love that. I mean, I think that is just such a massive edge that people in 2026 miss. Everybody wants shortcuts and AI and, oh, here's what the analytic profile says. Here's what the data says. Here's what the film guys say. I'm just going to throw it all into a model and yada, yada. You got to understand the nuances and the specifics of each profile. We talk about this every year. I always love that you break that stuff down in the rookie guide. RotoViz breaks it down so well in the rookie guide every year. We, Shawn, often on Bananas, talk, especially this time, like coming up next, we're going to be talking about the free agents and a lot of that stuff. Again, I focus more on a lot of the veteran stuff and the macro level stuff this time of year, but felt like today would be a good show to get a 30,000 foot view of the rookie class for this year. So for anyone who hasn't really dug into the rookies yet, that's what you're going to get here. It's going to be for those of you that are like deep in the dynasty weeds, maybe a little bit more basic. And I know a lot of people that are listening this time of year are much deeper in the weeds than I am at this point with the rookies. I'm just trying to learn how to pronounce the names and that stuff right now. But we're going to talk through it. I'm going to get your thoughts. I want to get up to speed on the top names. Everyone's talking about this being a really poor class. Get from you whether that is actually an accurate representation. And then, the next couple of weeks, we'll probably talk free agency and stuff and then get back more into the rookies, maybe in April, leading up to the draft after maybe I've had some time to actually learn the player names. But how you doing? How's it going today?
Good. It's always so fun to get those combine results in there. And just big picture, we know that these are very important numbers, I think, especially for running backs and for tight ends. And then at the wide receiver position, we know there are a lot of guys who were so overdrafted because of athleticism or speed, what have you, that when you look at their draft slot and it's a guy with great athleticism, you actually want to knock that draft slot down a little bit to actually represent where the player truly should go, right? It's that overdrafted, which isn't to say that athleticism doesn't matter. We're talking about professional sports. You think about someone like a Jackson Smith and Jigba and what he did last year and his testing at the combine, or he had the Christian McCaffrey like agility numbers. And you think about guys who separate off the line of scrimmage, and then for JSN, really separate at any point in his route that he wants to separate. Boom, he's gone. No one can stay with him doing that. Athleticism matters, right? We do want to keep it also within the context of production, because production is what really tells you what the guy is going to be like at the NFL level, and certainly age-adjusted production from guys who are earlier in their college careers, who are not up into their mid-20s. That production is going to be a lot more representative of a player who will be able to translate well. It's so funny because kind of as you hinted at, and as just becomes very obvious, it's funny to see some of the trade offers early in Dynasty season, where usually at this time, right, if someone wants to get a first round pick, they are going to be offering a bunch of extra in order to move in and get that. Ben, I've had some offers for first round picks this year where people are essentially trying to get out of the first round so badly that they're offering you multiple extra things to get out as opposed to get into it. At the same time, it's also a fascinating class because, and it will be interesting to, hear some of the people who just do this exclusively and perhaps even are focused on the training portion of it more than anything else, where this is a bad class. And yet Blair Andrews has done the 3 Freak Score articles for the site, running back, wide receiver, tight end, and discussed the athletic profiles of these guys. And even within this class that is awful, it's sort of a record-breaking class from a pure testing perspective. We do have athletic freaks in the group. And so then the next question is, can any of these guys, number one, are they going to really elevate? And then number 2, does that make them sort of fun, at least flyers, or does that make them trap picks as we think about, kind of this overall puzzle? So certainly,
that's what I was.
So much fun to talk rookies, right after the combine.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you as we kind of just keep talking about the class at large. One of the things I always think about when people are like, oh, this class sucks, and you start talking about people wanting to trade out of the first round so much that they're willing to give extra stuff relative to, what that valuation may have been in another year where you had to potentially pay up because people really want to come up. They want to get one of these, 5 or 6 profiles. They're like, these are great profiles. We know the great profiles don't always translate to great fantasy players. There's busts. There's players that don't actually. I mean, I think I've told the story on the show before. I always think of this one team I had where I drafted basically every good profile, especially wide receiver profiles that didn't pan out over the course of several years. It started with like Leonte Carew years and years ago, but I know that team had Laviska Shenault on it. It had Traylon Burks more recently. I mean, it's just like every single dude that ended up being a miss. N'Keal Harry, I traded it.
I think Harry was on there from your.
He was on that list.
To me of the past.
Yeah, it's and so we know that some of these profiles don't always pan out. At the same time, we know that some profiles that are good but have holes, that players can overcome that at times for reasons that are not always clear or easy to understand. I mean, you mentioned like a JSN. Typically, when we see a real ceiling, it's a guy like a JSN that does have that profile, and that's the important point in the line to draw. But there's also guys like the other superstar wide receiver that's right there with him right now that was like right neck and neck with him for offensive player of the year is Puka Nacua, who's a guy who was a day 3 pick. And coming in at this point in the offseason, people were like, this is maybe an interesting 3rd round rookie pick or whatever, later guy, maybe not even 3rd round. And so my question to you becomes, as we just talk about it from a dynasty lens and more of a 30,000 foot view, if everyone's trying to get out of the first round and everyone's so confident this, and yet we know there's uncertainty with profiles translating to production, how confident should we be that this class is going to underproduce, even though the profiles themselves are meaningfully bad? Is it that bad? Is it so bad that we should be pretty confident that there's not going to be really any superstars in 2026?
Well, they're going to be stars. And so I think a lot of it comes down to, if you have those very top picks. And so this is kind of the perfect time to always make that little plug for the RotoViz Triflex leagues over at the FFPC, where the backdraw matters. And then I was, again, fortunate enough, because good fortune always comes into play with all of this, but to only miss the playoffs in 1 of 9 leagues last year, and the team that missed was good. And so then, and we had this interesting question of whether or not we want to trade Chase Brown for a future first sort of at the trade deadline. In a lot of ways, that would look like a pretty smart trade. You have a running back who, because of some parts of his past, probably doesn't have an incredibly wide moat and isn't playing particularly well. He'll start to get a little bit older. You're like, a first round pick for that would be great. But you're also thinking, well, one of the fun parts about this is that you need to win the back draw. And so we're like, it's probably not quite enough because we want the 101. We keep him, we win the 101, and we now have the opportunity to select Jeremiah Love. And again, as probably anybody who is listening to the show knows, I mean, this is a guy who is basically Bijan Robinson with more straight line speed. I mean, probably not quite the level of wiggle that you get from Bijan. I mean, just people as big as Bijan Robinson simply don't have his lateral agility. But the other thing would be sort of Jonathan Taylor with receiving ability. So if you put it somewhere kind of in that mix, I mean, you're talking about someone where if you have the 101, you're very, very excited.
So
if
that was
any other pick, it's probably a different story.
Okay. I wanted to start with Love because there's a lot of talk that he was going to go in the top 10 picks, that he may go in the top 5 picks. Whoever has like pick 7, there's been, rumors that he might go there. I heard the Giants, who have like 5 or whatever, are thinking about it, and which is a bummer for our guy Cam Scattaboo. But new regime there, and they may think he's that talented. It seems odd for some of these teams that are maybe not good enough.
Well, a lot of the mocks that I saw immediately after the combine had him going 4 to the Titans. And I mean, that would be an exciting pick for them, but it's also like the Titans need more than a running back, right? So it becomes tricky when you're talking about taking that running back that high. But again, that's how good he is.
Well, and that's the question. He's going to go that high. Ashton Genty went that high last year, but he also went to a situation in the Raiders that is like what you were just describing with the Titans, and obviously was not able to meet expectations in year one. He wasn't an immediate breakout superstar. He had some interesting stuff late in the season that I think people maybe missed a little bit, especially people who drafted him are going to be like, I'm out on this dude because their team wasn't good for most of the fantasy season. That tends to happen with you draft a rookie and he's not good the first half of the year. Then you're like, I'm never using this guy again. We don't think Ashton Genty sucks at this point. I don't think on this program. I don't mean to speak for you, but he was good late in the year for a tough situation.
Yeah, I love it.
Okay. You're still very much in there, but where does Love fall in terms of not just the Genty concern about, okay, any running back that's in a situation like that is going to have a hard time elevating, but you compared him to Jonathan Taylor, Bijan Robinson, some of these really good athletic. So based on those names, I assume we have some size, we have some speed here. Again, I've barely even looked at this. For the other people who aren't paying a ton of attention, from a profile perspective, you're talking about him like the better profiles. That's how we've always talked about Taylor, Bijan, going back to Saquon Barkley as some of the best running back profiles coming in the last decade. Clearly, that's lofty praise.
And he doesn't have the massive numbers that some of those guys have had, right? In a 16-game season in 2024, he put up 1,400 yards from scrimmage, including 29 receptions. He has the 20 total touchdowns. Now, the touchdown numbers are obviously up there. One of the things that jumped out to me a year ago when I was putting together the blurbs for the rookie guide was that he had the top points above average per attempt on the season. So SIS is basically saying that in terms of how we assign value to plays in the running game, that he's more valuable than any of these other guys. The last year obviously was a pretty fun running back class. And for Love to sit atop all of that. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that number from SIS is one that translates particularly well, but certainly when we're thinking about just how good a guy is, even abstracted from what the numbers are, that was certainly very encouraging. And you've got the roundedness of the profile. Then he comes back in 12 games this year and goes for 1,650. And again, the 21 total touchdowns, again, very involved as a receiver. And then as a 212-pound back, you go to the combine. And Ben, for a 212-pound guy, it was kind of funny because I was showing some highlights to some vaguely interested family members and showing him run and showing Sadiq run, someone we'll talk about obviously soon. And Sadiq is much, much bigger. And yet everyone watching was kind of surprised because the look of Love is one of these guys who is basically just a superhero, right? And you've got this running back who looks like a superhero, and then he runs a 4.36, and you're just kind of thinking to yourself, a player of that size shouldn't be that fast. And one of the things we know is that Jonathan Taylor had all these massive runs in college, and then he goes to the combine, runs in the 4.3s, and you're like, yeah, this is going to definitely translate. And then he falls on the NFL draft, and you're thinking, we don't need to relitigate all of this. But obviously the whole point there is he was extraordinary. We had every reason to believe it was going to continue. It has continued. He fell in the draft.
You don't want to talk about how the Chiefs didn't take Jonathan Taylor again?
But the interesting thing, though, now, right, Ben, is that with the number 9 pick, that's kind of the spot that becomes incredibly exciting. I think if you're just a fan of fantasy, if you're a fan of good offense, certainly if you are the rare person who is still a fan of the Chiefs. I mean, there are plenty of us who live in Kansas City, grew up in Kansas City, who are. Outside of that, obviously, it's the evil empire. But you have this potential because the Chiefs executed the tank at the end of the season once they were eliminated so well. And I mean, executed in part because just everybody's injured also. But they have a top 10 pick. And they have been very reluctant to use picks at the end of the first round. And some of these picks they've moved for or acquired in other ways, kind of in the middle of the second round, to take guys like this. One of the questions then becomes, has the running back situation been so bad for so long? Was the Breece Hall thing enough of sort of a PR nightmare, if in fact they even process it that way at all, that they would consider someone like this in the top 10, and will he get there? And that's going to be one of the storylines. And certainly, again, for me, it's a fun storyline, right? I want Jeremiah Love to the Chiefs.
I didn't realize you'd be getting your hopes up to this degree. It's not going to happen. What's worse, that he goes before or he makes it there and they don't take him? And that's worse. And that's if he makes it there, they're not going to take him. You know they're not. They're going to do something boring. That's just how the Chiefs are. I'm looking at his profile right now. He's still 20 years old through the end of May.
Right. So you also have one of the youngest players, if not the youngest player, among skill position guys in the draft. And, this is maybe not as important as it is for receivers, but it's awesome.
It tends to be pretty good in the running back stuff, though. We tend to see that the younger backs tend to have longer careers and be better and still have room to develop. And this guy was already a Heisman finalist. He was third in the Heisman. He won the Doak Walker Award last year at 20 and is now ready to go to the NFL. That seems like another really positive element here that, so Jeremiah Love, we got one superstar running back coming in. There's a reason he is going in early drafts. I saw he was going in the early second. I had somebody ask me if he landed with the Chiefs, what would happen? It seems like he would jump up into the first. Maybe you're already thinking he should be in the first. I mean, he certainly would jump up in the first. The question is, like, how high would he go with the Chiefs? Do you have a thought on that?
The tricky part there is who gets pushed out, right? And I think back to our show last week, which was so much fun. And I believe that the drafter at the turn did the sort of Genty Love double. And I've talked about how, like, Genty Hampton there is pretty interesting. And I do think that it's this question of Love as a rookie potentially being in a situation that's not great. I mean, I think that you could argue, Ben, that being with the Chiefs would be not great, right? It'd be certainly not anything like landing with the Raiders a year ago. But I think we have to at least consider the possibility that the Chiefs have gotten to the point where being their starting running back might not even be that great. Now,
yeah, I forgot that you also are a self-loathing Chiefs fan. Yeah, this is you get to be the running back for Patrick
in our coach's draft. Who drafted
that's right.
You were like, there's no link that this draft could go that I would take Andy Reid, the most successful coach of all time. What are we talking about here?
That's true. That's true. But playing with Patrick Mahomes is not low-key bad. They do have some issues on the offensive line. They do have a lot of work to do. I'm a pretty hard sell on their early, like we were talking a little bit about the futures odds and how flat they are this year. And the Chiefs they opened pretty low in the futures odds behind the Chargers. I remember, I think they maybe have moved ahead of them now, but it was like, they're not even the favorites from their own division, which we like the Chargers a lot. You've called them maybe the second best team in football on the last show. At this point, right? There's a lot that happens throughout an offseason. The Chiefs do have cap issues. They have some stuff that is getting worse along their offensive line. I saw and some of that stuff. And yet, when Patrick Mahomes played, I had a friend when I was talking about the Chiefs recently. Maybe I told this story on one of the recent episodes. Apologies if I did. It's a tough time of year for me to keep this stuff in track in the winter. But I had somebody mention, maybe are the Chiefs just bad now? And they lost a lot of games this year. When Patrick Mahomes played, I'm trying to remember exactly through which game he played as I look at their schedule. But they were like 6 and 7 when they lost to the Texans? Was he still in? Yeah, he was still in. He had a really bad game against the Texans. They fell to 6 and 7. They lost 20-10 in that game. The next week they lose to the Chargers. I believe that's the one where he got hurt, and they lose by 3. And he played most of that game. He had 16 completions for 28 attempts. Minshew came in, went 3 for 5. His injury was at the end of that game. The Chargers kicked a field goal late in the third to take a 3-point lead, and then that ended up being the final score. So I'm going to include that. They were 6 and 8 when Mahomes went out. Of their 8 losses, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 were by 1 score, and 5 of those were by exactly a field goal. And almost all of them were to playoff teams. They lost to the Chargers, Eagles, Jaguars, Bills, Broncos, Cowboys by 3 in Dallas, and then Texans and Chargers. All but the Cowboys were playoff teams this year, some of the best teams in the league. The Chiefs just had a really tough season. Mahomes wasn't great, etc. They closed with 3 bad losses after that 6 and 8 record to fall all the way to 6 and 11. This idea that they're bad now doesn't track. They won games 28-7, 31-0, 30-17, 37-20 against the Ravens in week 4 when the Ravens were still good, and 22-9. All of their wins were almost double digits except the one against the Colts. They mostly dominated teams when they won and then lost by field goals when they lost, which in the past have been really good in 1-score games. And that was always, can that stick? It all hit back with regression this year. And I had some concerns with Reed, and we know how much scheme was really important this year. And I do think in situational spots they struggled. They're going to try to address that this offseason.
Well, but they've tried to address it for multiple seasons. So
Sure.
again, you come back to if they can. Now, I think that the running back is the key piece. And so you think about someone like Love. One of the things that they've done very poorly in the last several years, and I wrote about this preseason and thought that there was at least a small chance that we would get Smith used a little bit more and that he would be a part of the solution, but they haven't thrown to the running backs well. And so you're not getting the guys out in space. You're not using weapons, but they haven't had weapons there. The thing that a Love pick would do in the same way that having someone like a Breece Hall or having someone like a Travis Etienne is that you have a guy where there's receiving ability. Etienne would probably at this point be the weakest of that group. We know obviously that Love is being put in a situation with the Jets where he'll probably be back. But if you're looking at a back who you can just hand him the ball like the Chiefs have done in a very vanilla way with their guys, and he can break all of these big plays, and suddenly you have to account for him, but then also just because he's out there on the field all the time is going to get some receptions. And then you have the immense value of having a big, fast guy in space. I mean, it should be fantastic. You look at some of the other teams that are kind of...
Before we move on, I got to go back to the Chiefs. Shawn, they went 6 and 11. They lost almost twice as many games as they won. What is your guess that their point differential was this year?
It was positive.
Yeah, they were plus 34. They were plus 2 points per game. It wasn't even like a little bit positive. Plus 34 is meaningful. They were 12th in the NFL in point differential with a 6 and 11 record. They had a better point differential than the Chargers, who went 11 and 6. They won 5 more games than the Chiefs did and had a worse point differential. Obviously, there's other teams there. The Steelers, the Panthers are the funny one who made the playoffs. They were 8 and 9. They did lose more games than they won with a negative 69 point differential. But we do see that point differential more than wins and losses tends to correlate year over year. And that's why I was talking about the close wins and everything. It's just really funny to me that they were better than the Packers. They were better than the Bears. Multiple playoff teams with winning records. The Bears were another 11 win team. The Steelers were a 10-win team. They went 6 and 11. They only won 6 games, but they won those 6 games by margins enough and lost all the 11 games by margins small enough that they had better point differentials than 3 double-digit win teams, multiple, even more positive, above 500 teams, and teams that made the playoffs. It's just hilarious to me. But anyway, you were trying to move on.
Well, and one of the things that I think is so fascinating when we have these discussions about like top 15 picks and the weirdness when an elite team has either made a trade in the past where they've traded into a future draft and end up with a high pick, or in a situation like this where the Chiefs, where as soon as they knew they were going to miss, their goal is like, we don't get early picks. This pick has to be as early as it possibly can be. And they execute that and they get up here, they're going to have some early picks. And then the question becomes, okay, you look at the two teams drafting right ahead of them in the Washington Commanders and the New Orleans Saints, and you're thinking, well, one of these two teams has Jaden Daniels and doesn't really have a running back, and they supposedly want to be more under center. They're going to run a more vanilla offense. Now, probably not really more vanilla. They're going to run an under center offense that takes away some of Daniels' strengths, but they actually want it to be more multifaceted than what they've run in the past. That stuff would be easier to believe with a different coaching staff that probably would be able to execute it better. But the Commanders are a team where you're like, if that's the direction you want to go and you want to cover up for the fact that you're a defensive head coach with a terrible defense, having Love would be a perfect piece. New Orleans Saints, I mean, Kamara is done. They haven't been able to get guys behind him. You have a really controversial but interesting young QB. You have Kellen Moore doing a fantastic job coaching. You have this soft schedule that you're going to play against because you're in the NFC South. And if you put Love into that, then maybe that is a spectacular environment. And then you have Kansas City, and probably he passes all of those guys, right? We're currently sitting at sort of peak combine enthusiasm so the mock drafts are going to reference that. And yet, when you're looking at these teams, it's always this question of, okay, the Commanders and Saints, he'd be a perfect fit, but those teams need basically everything, right? And you also have cap issues where if you draft a running back in the first round, you're not going to be able to land on a player at a position that's expensive and fix some of your problems. I mean, you really need to go somewhere else, but you're like, these are poorly run franchises. Maybe they'll make the wrong decision. Conversely, when you have an elite team up there, you're like, an elite team could make a luxury pick, and the luxury pick might be the last piece of the puzzle. But because they're a well-run team, they probably won't select a running back. So both things kind of work against that pick, making it interesting to think through how any of these teams in this range might approach it. Then again, he might go number 4 to the Titans, so you never know.
Yeah, that's a really well put thing. It always seems like it's a worse outcome than we want, and you really just detailed why. It's because the good teams didn't get good making the luxury, the luxury picks on the non-premium positions. The Giants would be the one that would devastate me the most. I mean, not just Scatterboo. They already have Tyrone Tracy. They don't need any of that. And then I also don't want him playing for Matt Nagy or under Matt Nagy. We'll see what happens with the Giants. I think they could still be fun. Jackson Dart looked good to me in his rookie year. I was just looking again at the point differential stuff. There was 10 other teams that had double-digit losses. The next closest one was the Giants in terms of point differential, and they had 13. They were 4-13. Still had a decent negative 58 point differential, but I was going to say it that way as well, that for a team with 10 losses to have even just a positive differential, there's no one even within, it looks like 90 points of the Chiefs. But anyway, the Giants were the closest team because they had a better year, I think, than people realized last year. We'll see what happens with them with John Harbaugh, Matt Nagy, and company. I hope that he doesn't land there because then you also have other good backs on the roster. It's just, that would be a disaster. Anyway, Love is fantastic. You were saying to me before the show, the rest of this running back class, not great. The guy who I'm seeing on some lists as number 2, and you shared with me sort of your input for the second volume of the rookie guide, what you're kind of thinking in terms of some ranking stuff, and you have him second at the running back position, is a UW guy, Jonah Coleman. We talked very briefly about him on the last episode. I said I wanted to get your thoughts on the UW guys. One of the fun things here is you hate the University of Washington and everything that I love for reasons that is hard for me to understand. It's very mean. But there is a top 5 running back and a top 5 wide receiver this year from UW that we're going to have to talk about. And Coleman is that running back, and you do have him at RB2. So this may be the first Husky that you've ever actually liked.
He barely sneaks into the back end of the first round for me. And that's really only because you have another massive tier break where we can't fill the first round even with 12 meaningfully good prospects. I think he's fine, right? You have a 220-pound back who caught 87 passes in college. Last year, 31, gained over 10 yards per reception last year with Washington. Been the Peripherals are okay. Obviously, he didn't test. He's not expected to be particularly athletic. Next Gen has him estimated 18th overall in the class as an athlete, but they also would agree with the general idea that from a production standpoint, he's solid, at least the second best back in the class. That's where they have him rated there. It's interesting because the other couple of guys that he is seemingly competing with, the number 2 back on a lot of boards, and this kind of goes back to the Roschon Johnson thing, at least a bit for me, with Roschon arguably being the superior of the 2 guys. But the number 2 prospect is a small, old-ish, slow backup to Jeremiah Love. Now, his backup in Jadarian Price does have fantastic evasion numbers, and evasion numbers tend to be slightly undervalued by NFL teams as they're making their running back draft selections. So I'm not saying that there is nothing to justify having Price as an interesting player. But again, the only reason Price would be interesting at that level would be if you don't think anyone else in the class is good. The other back, the back that I think is really fun to watch, would be Emmett Johnson. He unfortunately performed very poorly at the combine, and running back, that combine performance does matter. The number of players that we have that we can still really lean into and grab, like a Bucky Irving, which we did, and I think it makes sense to do. I mean, you're looking at the production, but we have to always keep in mind that that particular profile where you don't have the athleticism and you still hit is pretty rare.
And so Price, the other thing you could say for Price, though, is if Jeremiah Love is really that good, that it's just undeniable. It's not great that a guy that was 2 years younger than him was just better than him and starting over him and all those things. But I mean, if Love is just that good, if he's an all-time great running back, then that justifies.
Yeah, no, and we see players like that occasionally, but I think the small sample element can be tricky. And that was a little bit what we got with Roschon, where Roschon was fantastic in the small sample, right? And I don't think that just because he didn't succeed that we say, oh, this whole thing doesn't work. I mean, just like you don't pick out one guy in some other type of profile and say, oh, this would never work because this guy failed. But certainly I would want to have a little bit more of a size athleticism combination to back it up if I'm also looking at someone whose overall raw production isn't there, and then, you know, the speed isn't there.
It's rare for the kind of committee backs in college to wind up being studs in the pros, but I guess that was like Alvin Kamara. That was true for, right? He was more of a committee back at Tennessee, was it? And then has been able to be.
Yeah, and one of the things with him is that he tested extremely well. And I'm sure that some people are going to push back a little bit on Price's results. It's not like they were terrible. He runs a 4.49. He has the poor 10-yard split. He's got okay jumps. But at 203, if you weren't a big-time star in college, then, I mean, at that size, I love the small backs, right? But there needs to be something with the small size to really back up the idea that this guy can be more than, you know, really the back end of a committee or just a very situational type of back. It's frustrating to have a draft class that's so weak where someone who projects as a situational player at the NFL level would be like the number 2 or number 3 guy off the board.
Yeah. Coleman, you talked about, I just want to mention, I said my comp, I think on the show last week was Josh Jacobs. And then he said at the combine when asked that he compares himself to Josh Jacobs, he's like, it's a very great call. You mentioned with some size, it's compact size that he also plays well in the pass game. He's not like an explosive player, but he does run to daylight. He does eat up ground. That's where I think the Josh Jacobs comparison, like Josh Jacobs always impresses me with the rate of like, not necessarily like explosive plays, but big plays. And he gets downhill. He's not just 3 yards in a cloud of dust, obviously, even though I sometimes, mock the athleticism and call him sort of a grinder and those things. He does create some big plays despite not being all that explosive by NFL running back standards. That's sort of the way that Coleman played at Washington, in my opinion, as somebody who obviously watches a lot of the Washington Huskies. You mentioned Price, you mentioned Johnson being a little bit of a disappointment, somebody you really liked as far as the testing went. The last name I want to ask you at running back before we move on is Mike Washington, was somebody that I saw a lot of buzz about that tested really, really well at the combine. Is the profile just not great there, or what are we thinking? Sorry.
So he's the one where I think you get pretty excited now. And yet you always keep in the back of your head, like, how many times do we have these sort of freak score stars, these combine heroes, even at the running back position, where in your mind, you're like, you just take the ball and run forward fast, right? And if someone's in your way, hit them and keep running forward. The production profile is very disconcerting. Now, he does go for over 1,000 yards last year at Arkansas. That's after 3 years at Buffalo, where he doesn't do a lot, after a year at New Mexico State, where he's not particularly impressive. But one of the things there with Arkansas as well is that he catches 28 passes in 12 games last year. So if we're looking at the last season, you have some blow up enthusiasm. I think the other concern that I have is that he's one of these guys who, as a bigger back, is still not particularly successful in the evasion metric, right? And so you think of some of the fast names, you think of some of the big guys where they don't actually show that at all on the NFL field. And from that perspective, you're thinking, I mean, does it really matter if a guy has this level of athleticism, if he can't even do it as an older player against college guys? Now, SIS has him at 17% for evasion, which isn't the kind of catastrophic levels of like a Israel Abanikanda type of player, but anybody kind of going below 20, and especially if you're a big back who's going to be relying on this athleticism narrative to be the thing that carries you, and you don't actually make guys miss at the college level, you don't break tackles at the college level, I mean, you're not going to be beating NFL players. That's just simply not the way that it works. The other name that is vaguely along this same line, but hasn't been able to do the offseason stuff because of injury, Nicholas Singleton was this sort of legendary prospect or recruit for Penn State, and then put up some pretty interesting raw numbers at times for them, has a bad final season, and now there are just a lot of questions because of the injury. But you're talking about Singleton being someone who is this amazing size athleticism prospect, but doesn't beat college guys. The evasion numbers are through the floor, even much worse than Mike Washington. And again, you're thinking, it doesn't really matter how big and fast you are. You got to be able to translate that into beating opponents opposite you on a football field. If you don't have that, it's going to be tough.
I don't know if I've ever heard that phrase through the floor, but I really liked it. It was a really good way of saying the evasion numbers are through the floor. A really good way of saying they're just not good. All right, let's talk about the receivers. At the top, Carnell Tate is the name that is being floated as a top 10 pick. Sounds like potentially. We're seeing a lot of Jordan Tyson from Arizona State, Mekhi Lemon from USC. Those seem to be like the top three, if I'm not mistaken. And then that's where my Washington guy, Denzel Boston, kind of comes in. I felt like you were going to be more down on Boston. It's funny, you mentioned with Coleman, you have him sort of at the end of your first round if you're doing like a rookie draft rankings right now, even though you have him at his RB2. You do have Boston ahead of him because you have a lot more receivers in that first round. You do think there's some talent at the top at wide receiver. Boston is a guy who's like a size player, scored a lot of touchdowns. I know you like the touchdowns, didn't necessarily have massive yardage numbers. I'm interested in him as far as, my thoughts on a Washington player and what I saw. I'm interested in him at the next level from the perspective that I could see him succeed. I could see him fail. I probably doubt that there's a huge ceiling there. But he has the size and he has a frame and he does everything that you kind of want. I feel like there will be film people that really like him. It doesn't surprise me that he goes this high, despite sort of the production not always being there. But he did deal with some injuries at times. He did deal with some less than elite quarterback play. Some of the early production lack of production can be explained by Washington having really good wide receivers, obviously at the end of the Michael Penix era, and with a Dunze, Jalen Polk, and Jalen McMillan, who all got drafted highly, even though they haven't necessarily collectively been great at the NFL level. But Boston is a guy who reminds me a lot of like the Michael Pittman, Drake London model of, X receiver, legit, like but more like size, like thick, like possession, but and red zone and those types of things. But anyway, he not one of the very top names in this class. Those are Tate, Tyson, Lemon, those types. And then KJ Concepcion is the dude that I kept seeing a lot of excitement about around the combine and how he looked as maybe a little bit of a sleeper name to touch those groups. What do you see at the very top?
Well, I think the guy that we have to probably start with is Carnell Tate. And I think that he's going to be very difficult to get a read on because his situation is somewhat unique playing there at Ohio State. You have this combination of elements that are going to deflate your numbers at the same time that when you are playing in an efficient offense with a potentially all-time great prospect opposite you, there are things that are going to inflate your production simply because when teams are trying to deal with Jeremiah Smith, they can't also be giving you that coverage. And then you just throw in all of these other concerns where we have a guy who could go in the top 10 and yet he's not in the same universe as his teammate. And this is, again, one of the reasons why people will be trying to trade out of this draft into next year's draft. There are more really high-end prospects a year from now. But I mean, if we're talking about like Carnell Tate in the top 10, where would you take Smith next year? I mean, our team, you think about like -5 or -10, and obviously that would be reflected by the not really being taken before the draft starts. But with the types of packages that a team would pay to select like a Travis Hunter type of player, it's hard for me to think that when you have such an epic gap between two guys that just because of the draft itself and the need for wide receivers that they might not go that far apart, because I mean, they are separated by oceans in terms of what they are. You have with Tate a player who, you know, goes to Ohio State, plays for 3 years. This last year misses some games with injury, but plays 3 seasons and doesn't have a 1,000-yard season, doesn't have a 10-touchdown season. The first 2 years, in part because they're pretty loaded, right? I mean, think about having Smith, think about having Emeka Egbuka, who went in the first round last year and then had a very good first half of the season. One of the things that makes it a little bit tricky to make some of these comparisons is that we're not 100% sure yet what all of these Ohio State guys are. I mean, what's a Marvin Harrison? Who is Emeka Egbuka? Even though Harrison and Tate don't have as much direct overlap in terms of it being relevant because that would be Tate's freshman year, you're still thinking about a situation where for an Ohio State receiver, Marvin Harrison was supposed to be this greatest receiver of all time, and he's been a bust. I don't know that it's still completely impossible that he would get his career going like a Devontae Adams, but it's certainly disconcerting. I mean, Tate is basically a poor man's Marvin Harrison more than he is a different other style receiver. And so you have some weaknesses there. When I put together a page for myself, sort of comparing Tate to the other Ohio State wide receivers, it's very clear that he comes in well behind sort of a JSN and a Marvin Harrison. He also comes in behind a Garrett Wilson and a Chris Olave, which isn't to say that he wouldn't be good. I mean, Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave have been good NFL players. If you got a little bit weaker player than that, maybe you'd be pretty happy with it. He's a little bit more of in the Egbuka type of category. But one of the things that's interesting and I think fascinating about his numbers is that you have this yards per route number that is pretty compelling. But when you dig into it, you find that the targets per route aren't particularly good. And you find that the sort of after the catch element, the evasion numbers aren't particularly good. And so if you're talking about someone who isn't demanding maybe a huge number of targets, again, in part because his teammate is so amazing, but also isn't dynamic with the ball in his hands after the catch, and then he goes to the combine and performs pretty disappointingly. Now, the numbers that he put up are in no way something that would be disqualifying for a good receiver. We have plenty of stars who run in the mid 4.5s at the receiver position, right? But when we're starting to stack up all of these mild concerns, and I say mild concerns, I mean, these are concerns in terms of historically what has worked. One of the things that I really always wanted to bring up with Marvin Harrison was this idea that with the ball in his hands, he was not good. And you contrast that with guys like, and one of the names that comes up with Tate is a CeeDee Lamb. CeeDee Lamb, much more dynamic with the ball in his hands. Guys like Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase, the stars, much more dynamic with the ball in their hands. Now, does that mean that Tate is going to miss? I don't think that it does. I mean, the production on a per play basis is still very exciting. And certainly within the context of this class is going to be someone where that's going to be in demand, especially as one of the youngest prospects. It's just something where I think that if you are assuming stardom here and you're assuming a really high floor, I think that's probably not the case.
When you were talking through the per route stuff, I haven't even built out my spreadsheets for the prospects and looked at any of this stuff, but my ears perked up because, you know, the listeners will know that I love to use the targets per route and yards per target elements of yards per route to try to, you know, piece together what receivers are as sort of that foundational element, as I like to talk about. And I always say the foundational element because you always want to contextualize within the offense and the different things. And there's so much context that goes in. But when you talk through the Jeremiah Smith thing, 87 catches, 1,243 yards, 12 touchdowns for Smith, who's basically Julio Jones. And any team that's playing them, again, the context for Carnell Tate, anyone who's playing them is focusing on this athletic freak. And yet he's still the one that's producing the most. I have to assume he got doubled more than Tate in those things. I haven't looked at any of this, but Carnell Tate had 51 catches compared to 87 for Smith, but he had 875 yards, which is actually comparatively closer because he averaged over 17 yards per catch. Smith is at a good number at 14.3 yards per reception. This is different than yards per target, but Tate, 17.2 yards per reception. It gets back to that point you were just making about he had production, but you said he didn't really have the targets per route. And he also didn't really have the yards after the catch. And so for people that were just sort of listening to that and saying, well, Shawn, like, where did the production come from? Because you're saying there's still some decent production. Like, what are you saying? For me, as somebody who breaks it all up, what I hear there is air yards. He caught passes down the field. And so a couple different things. One, the higher the ADOT, the higher the correlation with yards per target as a stat, yards per reception. When you see 17 yards per reception, especially when you tell me he didn't do a lot after the catch, it means he's catching balls down the field. It has to happen that way. We also know that higher ADOTs tend to correlate negatively with the yak stuff. So there's maybe a little bit of a defense of him. But my concern when you're playing with a guy like Jeremiah Smith, when I'm trying to contextualize this, my immediate concern for him would be that a lot of his production was because of soft coverages and those things, because Jeremiah Smith's so dominant. He's going to draw doubles. He's going to draw more attention. And then Tate is getting the thing that we heard that stat from Mina Kimes that I talked about around the Super Bowl, where JSN, when he was on the field running a route, Seattle receivers downfield specifically averaged twice as much separation compared to other deep routes around the league, the baseline for the season. That gravity allowed one-on-ones and allowed opportunities that a good wide receiver can take advantage of, but probably not necessarily a great one if that's all your production is. If you're telling me all the red flags are he can't do stuff after the catch, he didn't earn targets per out at a high rate. Now, people will say he had Jeremiah Smith out there with him. That's why he wasn't earning targets at a high rate. Fair. But if all the production, and we need more production, like you were saying, I mean, this is, I don't know. The way that you talk through that to me, my antenna's up for this is a pretty big concern. Again, this is just somebody listening to you and offering my own thoughts about how I analyze these things. But for somebody who is mostly producing because of deep receptions, not adding a lot after the catch, and we would expect because of his specific situation that he's getting advantageous deep situations, that point about the double separation JSN thing would be an argument that Carnell Tate is getting one-on-ones against inferior corners, not even the team's best corner at times. And that's when he's getting his targets. He's not necessarily earning them as much as he's getting in these situations that are going to funnel volume toward him and increase his efficiency. And he's making those plays because he's a good player. But if you're talking about a top 10 player, even though he played with a player as good as Jeremiah Smith, and as you said, would be somebody that would be, if Carnell Tate's a top 10 pick, would be a negative pick, as you were alluding to. I mean, this is a guy that's an all-time wide receiver prospect. So you have to caveat these things. I'm just saying, as far as those specific points that you made, the way that I'm interpreting them, they seem a specific concern for the context of Carnell Tate. I would like to have seen him do more that was attributed to him with the ball in hand stuff or with earning volume that I can be like, hey, this guy's actually pretty good relative to a situation, as opposed to just making caveats that, oh, he didn't have a lot of targets because he was playing with Jeremiah Smith. He didn't have a lot of production, this and that. But there is some efficiency there in the situations that, again, I think most wide receivers would benefit from running opposite Jeremiah Smith in exactly those ways. I would like to see him add more than that to a degree greater than what you just described. So anyway, that was just my sort of
and to
filter.
Make it completely clear what I'm trying to say on the after the catch stuff. It's not even so much that the after the catch stuff isn't there. It's but specifically like how much of it did you really do yourself? SIS has him for 5 broken tackles and 3 forced missed tackles, which gives you a relatively low evasion rate. I was referencing the comps to CeeDee Lamb. In 2019, Lamb had 62 receptions, 32 evaded tackles.
Yeah.
It's a completely different area in terms of where these guys are and what our expectations should realistically be for them, which doesn't mean that Tate couldn't succeed. It's just what our expectations are should probably be calibrated to what he did on the field.
And to the points that I was just making about Jeremiah Smith, obviously Jeremiah Smith is going to overshadow Tate to some degree, but there's also this element of it's creating good looks that I was trying to emphasize. Lamb was a number 1. Lamb was doing all that, and all of his production in college was coming when he's the guy that defenses are scheming for. When you understand football and you think about what are defensive coordinators doing when they play this team in a week? What is their game plan? When you're playing Ohio State, you're scheming for Jeremiah Smith. I don't think there's the biggest Carnell Tate fan, I don't think would dispute that, because Jeremiah Smith, again, is widely not just thought of, but like known to be an elite wide receiver prospect, somebody who's going to shape this position in the future. He had 1,300 yards as a true freshman, 15 touchdowns, and helped lead Ohio State to a national championship. Followed that up with 1,243 yards in year 2 and 12 in fewer games. So his yards per game actually went up from 82 to 96 as a true sophomore. There's nothing that we've seen through 2 years that suggests that all the hype around Jeremiah Smith, which was there when he came into college, is anything but completely valid. So anyway, this is going to be
a bit clear. Tate was a super high recruit as well. And so then you always have this question of how much of how he's looked at now is his recruiting profile still carrying through. And sometimes that's good because like this guy has been awesome forever. We just don't really have any questions about him. And then occasionally it can be a thing where if you are still living a bit on how you were perceived previously and people aren't updating, that could be a bit of a problem too.
Yeah. And then to be fair to Tate, though, like one of the things that can be said here is, look, he was playing alongside Smith. I just made the point with the Notre Dame backs. Like, look, if Smith's just that good that even when they're doubling him, he's putting up all this production, it does make it a little tough. And maybe the only time the ball is actually going to Tate is when, Jeremiah Smith's like triple covered or whatever it is, because it's so easy to get the ball to Smith. Maybe that's not fair. And maybe we see a different gear from Tate at the next level. I feel like we probably have from an Olave, for example. We have there's other players, the players that played with multiple, Justin Jefferson and Jamar Chase playing together in college, and how that made some people think that Jefferson didn't have as much of a ceiling, was more of a floor type prospect, more of a well-rounded but floor type prospect because he was overshadowed by his collegiate teammate. And now they're the 1-2 of the best wide receivers in the NFL. The problem is that Jefferson had more that he did, even though he was overshadowed by Chase alongside him. Like Brian Thomas even did more than what we're seeing with Tate. Brian Thomas had a massive number of touchdowns, even though he was playing off of Malik Neighbors, right, at LSU. Neighbors is dominating him in a lot of ways, but his efficiency was that much better than Tate's. It wasn't just this degree of efficiency. Oh, I caught some long passes and I have 900 receiving yards and I average 17 yards per catch, but even most of that was just air yards and not me doing it with ball in hand and those things. That was not Brian Thomas. Brian Thomas had freak efficiency. So anyway, something to consider.
With Justin Jefferson in that season that you referenced, over 700 yards after the catch, 269 yards after contact, 27 evaded tackles. in a season where his teammate went for 1,780.
That's crazy. Exactly. I mean, that's exactly what we're trying to say is like in a season where his teammate went for all this stuff, when he got his opportunities in positive situations, like I was describing, maybe against a secondary cornerback sometimes and one-on-ones, he's winning on that route. He's catching the ball. He's making that guy miss after the catch, and he's gaining all these additional yards. 700 yards after the catch for people that don't fully contextualize that. Tate had 900 yards total. 700 yards after the catch. Tate had 875 yards total, right? So, and typically air yards are the dominant element of a profile. Like I remember using some cutoffs early in my career where at the NFL level where 400 total yards after the catch was one of the cutoffs I used. If you had 400 yards after the catch, you're taking like a 1,200 yard season to a 1,600 yard season is sort of the way that I think about it. It's a big number. Everyone's going to add at least 100 or a couple hundred, but being able to add 700 yards after the catch over one season is a massive amount of additional yards after the catch. We're not seeing anything like that in the Tate profile. So it's a very different, I mean, just because other players that were in similar situations where they had great teammates succeeded at the next level doesn't mean that every guy is going to do that. It doesn't mean that you don't look at the profiles individually. And those other profiles, you just mentioned the Jefferson stuff. I mean, that's even better than I would have guessed, but it's tough for Tate to match that with the profile that he actually had when we evaluate him on those grounds. But we've talked about Tate a ton. Jordan Tyson is the other guy that I'm seeing on a lot of lists right up there with him. And then Mekhi Lemon is third, but is one that I know you like.
Yeah, so Tyson is a guy where I think the long-term RotoViz fans are going to be, pretty fired up because you're talking about someone with a 43% dominator in 2024, plays 9 games last season and has a 56% dominator. We're talking about somebody who was the Arizona State passing offense. You have an absurd yards per team attempt number in 2024, sort of just off the charts. Then he comes back with a good number in 2025. And so when we're thinking about his numbers there it's not really a limited sample per se, but with the kind of truncated season, still, very good. We're looking at 20 games over the last 2 years and 18 touchdowns. Basically, you have the whole package here. He's going to be one of these guys who's sort of at that border in terms of 21, 22-year-old player. If he were even a little bit younger, some of the stuff in Blair's research would definitely pop even more in terms of how he is projected. I guess the only concerns that I would have with him were kind of coming back to this element where the yards per route, according to SIS last season, were not particularly high. And then the evasion was very, very low. And so as I continue to try and sift through and find the types of prospects where we have no red flags and where they have as many different ways to win as possible, anytime that I'm seeing really low evasion numbers, I'm thinking this could be an issue where the team that he goes to has to be able to make him fit, as opposed to being a Malik Neighbors type of player where what do you ask him to do, he's going to be able to do. I mean, Neighbors, another one of these guys with just the extraordinary numbers with the ball in hand. And we even think back to his rookie season where a lot of the targets are of very low value, and yet he's able to take some of those low value targets, beat a couple of guys, go for a 40, 50-yard touchdown. And suddenly you have this unstoppable force that doesn't seem to be what we're dealing with Tyson. And yet,
and in a modern NFL where we always talk about the cover 2 shells and taking away the explosive plays vertically and all that, the ability to do this short, a lot more offenses are trying to do that stuff. If you want to have a real ceiling statistically at the NFL level, what you just described, Malik Neighbors' ability to take a short pass and make guys miss, ball in hand, elite ability, that's going to be really helpful to building out an overall profile in the 2026 and beyond NFL. As far as how wide receivers win at the, put together 1,500 yard seasons. So anyway, yeah, I totally agree with that.
And so then with Lemon, we have an interesting player because he's getting a lot of these Amon-Ra comps. We know Amon-Ra has been an absolute fantasy force. The reason for those is because you have a slot guy here, but we have more reason, I think, to be comfortable with his overall profile when we have all of the different components, right? We have very high targets per route. We have very high yards per route. We have a catchable number that is extremely high. So we're not having big drops issues, only charted with a single drop last season. He's got this ADOT that's kind of in a middle range. One thing we haven't talked about a ton because it hasn't related to the individual guys that we're concerned about. But the other thing you run across that can be a bit of a red flag is if the player has a really high ADOT. And so you know that both they're probably living on vertical plays that allow them to exploit college defenses in a way that they won't be able to exploit NFL defense. But then just also that thing that we always used to talk about with Stephon Diggs, where you want and need the overall profile. You need those filler targets underneath. You need the intermediate targets. So that's a red flag. And obviously the guys with the really low ADOTs, also a red flag for pretty straightforward reasons. Lemon doesn't have those issues. He's got good touchdown numbers. He's got good evasion numbers. He's an early declare. And even to the point where his teammate, Jacoby Lane, certainly not someone that you're going to talk about at all in that Jeremiah Smith category, but there are some other players there who are also compelling. He's not doing it in this vacuum where, you would expect a decent player to put up these immense numbers. I mean, Lemon probably doesn't have the type of ceiling that you're looking for from the very first wide receiver off the board, either in the NFL draft or in your fantasy draft. But if we got someone who was Amon-Ra St. Brown, the fact that they're going to run a lot of their routes out of the slot is not going to be the thing that causes you problems from a fantasy perspective.
And so then beyond him, we have Boston. I shared some of my own thoughts on him. Concepcion, I think, are sort of the next couple. You have Omar Cooper and Chris Brazel, I'm going to take a guess is how you say his name, as some of the other interesting guys in your sort of rough first round here at this point. Who among those stand out?
Well, I'm gonna throw a little enthusiasm in the direction of Concepcion. He's a guy who comes out as a freshman in 2023 and goes over 2 yards per team attempt, goes for a 40-plus dominator, scores 4 touchdowns at NC State, and gains 320 rushing yards. If we want to look at this entire class and say, well, who was the best freshman? It was Concepcion. And that early breakout, we know, has been highly indicative of guys who go on and translate well to the NFL. Second season at NC State, not nearly as good, transfers to Texas A&M and puts up really not quite the same type of season as he had at NC State, but goes back over the 30% dominator again, goes over the 2 yards per team attempt again, hits for 9 more touchdowns, has over 15 yards per reception. He has, again, a rushing touchdown with 75 rushing yards. And this is a guy who is good with the ball in his hands. And so even though the per route numbers for him are not as gaudy as some of the guys that he's going to be compared one-to-one against, this is a player I think that has a very high floor. And certainly if he hits, I mean, we're off to the races. You really want these guys who dominate with the ball.
That is fun. He's a little bit undersized, right?
Yeah, and you would have liked to have seen him, go to the combine and blow things up. Athleticism is a bit of the calling card for him with that ball in hand stuff. His, hand size 9 1/4 is a little bit under 200, but certainly I think you could make the argument that in today's NFL, this 6 foot, 196 pound profile is more or less perfect for the kind of roundedness and flexibility that modern offenses need.
Anything on Boston, Cooper, Brazel, any of the later wide receivers that we should know about?
Well, we know that Cooper has had this fantastic season as a member of the Indiana juggernaut. And I mean, he's another guy where he sort of thrives in the slot off of his teammate who was the out wide player. His ADOT a little bit on the low end of the area where we feel comfortable. But again, a guy who was fantastic with the ball in his hands. And I think it's easy to be like, well, the team was really, really good. I mean, he's probably a so-so athlete. You play with the quarterback who, Ben, the quarterback position is sort of like that running back position, right? Where you have one guy who's going to go to the Raiders who looks like a generational type of player. And then if anybody else wants to fill their starting slot for next year, you're going to have to do things like try and figure out how you get Geno with all that contract mess, how you're going to get Tua, how you're going to get retired players like Derek Carr. We drafted Ty Simpson last week in the 19th round in our little fun best ball draft. I do think that he potentially can go at the end of the first round and is at least vaguely interesting there, but it's really just the one guy. And that we talk a bit about some of the numbers that Travis really uncovered when he was working here, and we continue to use because they're so fabulous in terms of actually being able to accurately gauge these QB prospects. Fernando Mendoza off the charts. You're playing with him. Your efficiency numbers should look pretty good. I think in that context, I mean, there's no reason to be incredibly excited about Cooper, but the other side of that QB playing so efficiently and spectacularly is that someone has to catch the ball. And so, not a Dunze type of prospect, but we think back to, your Huskies and how the guys on the other end of that, you don't know for sure until you see everybody at the NFL level, who was the chicken and who was the egg there. You had mentioned Boston and his per route numbers just okay for this past season. The evasion numbers pretty poor. I think that there's reason to be enthusiastic about some of the other numbers that he compiled. But as we talk about some of the red flags that we've discussed to this point, I think he's another guy there where I would be leery of how some of these numbers have been accumulated.
Yeah, I kind of feel like he's just not going to be able to have enough of a ceiling. Like, even if he hits, it's going to hit in a way that, because this is a weaker class, he's really pretty expensive to acquire. I think he might be a competent number 2 at the next level or something at some point. You're probably not talking about a fantasy superstar here.
And just again, to kind of conceptualize the stuff to contextualize for fantasy drafters, even though it's a weak class, because of the need for receivers, we definitely are seeing Lemon and Tate and Tyson and Boston mocked in the first round. And then you're often seeing Concepcion at the very end of the first round. You can see Cooper. You can occasionally see the Tennessee receiver mocked there. I think that someone like Trey Lance's brother, who was the player who just completely broke the combine at the wide receiver
position.
I
saw that. I didn't know he was Lance's brother. I saw, so he also played it at NDSU, right? He's another FCS guy and I saw he tested insanely well, but it's Lance's brother. There you go.
Yeah. And one of the concerns here is that he's very removed from high school. And so if you are that far along and you're playing at North Dakota State, it's pretty hard to trust the production, but the production was good, right? And then you go, and if you're 6'3", 204, and you then have the body control to run a 7-second 3-cone, but really the numbers we're looking at here are a 4.3, 440, a 1.49 10-yard split, a 41.5-inch vertical, over 11 feet on the broad jump. If you make the claim that Bryce Lance can play at all, that has any skills to go with the athleticism, I mean, he's not coverable if you have some skills. When we're thinking about how athleticism works at the wide receiver position, one of the things that I would note is that production of any kind, even if it's late and even if it's at a lower level, the players that I have the most concern about are these guys who are really fast, jump really high, and just they have never beaten a guy in college the whole time they were there. That's a huge problem. You're not going to beat guys at the NFL level either. But production of almost any kind that is meaningful at college, and then you test like this, I mean, probably once Lemon is off the board, Lance becomes the player that you might be the most excited about your personal favorite NFL team drafting.
I'm trying to figure out ways that if I really want him to hit, and I'm trying to back myself into ways that if he hits, I can claim that Trey Lance also wasn't a bust. It's not working in my head really, but I'm trying to figure out how that might come together. Let's talk about you mentioned the QBs. We can do that really quick. Fernando Mendoza, the presumed 101, the heavy favorite to go 101. You mentioned Ty Simpson might sneak into the first round. And then there's basically no other real quarterback prospect, like significant. It's like a 1.5 QB class, right? Is that sort of the way to look at it?
I think so. The other person who, I mean, it's really apples and oranges with the situation we just talked about with Bryce Lance. But you have Taylor Green, who is 6'6", 227 pounds. But he ran a 4.36 40 with a 43.5-inch vertical jump. Now, I'm sure there are plenty of football people who are like, you can look at all the numbers you want. Anthony Richardson was a way better prospect than Taylor
Can he
Green.
read a defense was the first thing that I thought in the back of my head.
My claim would be that if Anthony Richardson hadn't imploded so spectacularly, then you would have people backing Taylor Green as someone who, like, just give him a chance. Give him NFL coaching. Let him run around some. Unfortunately, Richardson did what he did, and so it's much harder for people to make the claim that someone who was ineffective in college, and Green was ineffective. His scheme-adjusted numbers were very, very poor.
Oh, he wasn't even good in college.
Right, so it's hard to make the claim that – and this is, again, one of the things where, I mean, we don't need to relitigate this one either, but Richardson had red flags that he was not a first-round pick, probably shouldn't have been anything other than a day 3 pick, but you're very captivated by that level of athleticism. And I mean, Green here, we're talking about athleticism that is unfathomable. You still have to be able to play a little bit.
My concern would be that I think the NFL's quarterback position, and I wrote about this at the newsletter in January, is really moving away from this. It wouldn't just be Richardson. My contention would be Richardson's one example, Trey Lance is one example, but even guys who had really good prospect profiles in college, but rely a lot on athleticism. Guys like Kyler Murray, who is now getting talked up a lot in free agency after he's going to be released. And Justin Fields last year, we were excited about. Even Jalen Milroe, we were excited about in that class. They tried to use him a little in the preseason. It seemed like I thought he was going to play some for Seattle last year. Instead, the other guy that I thought sucked.
It would have been interesting to see him if Sam Darnold hadn't played so well. I mean, think about, we still don't think Sam Darnold's particularly good, but what he did do was easily enough to box out someone like Milroe. How do you, in terms of that thesis, which I strongly agree with, how does someone like a Malik Willis fit, who basically hasn't played, and yet there certainly is enthusiasm about it? I mean, Green is someone where the path that seems to me to make the most sense would be a Malik Willis type of path where you are going to have to go and be in the NFL for a long time. You're going to have to refine your craft, and you're going to have to learn the things that NFL quarterbacks have to be able to learn from a scheme perspective and an execution perspective. And then when you get an opportunity because the quarterback in front of you goes down, you have to play well then, like Malik Willis has.
I think that's a really interesting name to throw out, because I wasn't trying to make the case that all athletic quarterbacks fail. We still have Lamar Jackson. We still have Jaden Daniels. We still have Josh Allen. We still have guys that do rely on athleticism in addition to being able to read defenses and throw the ball. And I think, that's the element. It's like the athleticism needs to be an addition, not the whole story. But Malik Willis is a really interesting one, because I do think the athleticism is probably a big part of the story for him. I saw some people talking about how good Malik Willis's downfield passing was last year, but it was like, he's like 13 of 14 for, at a certain ADOT on passes that traveled a certain distance or something. And it's like, yeah, and then it's insane efficiency. When you complete 13 out of 14 passes, the yards per attempt and everything are insane because there's just no incompletions to pull it down. But it's 14 passes. he's made 6 starts in his career. And I tweeted this, and somebody responded and was like, I wouldn't draw any trends from a 6-start, sample. I'm not trying to draw any trends from it, but he's never thrown more than 23 passes in a game. Even though he's made 6 starts, anyone's 6-game sample should have more than 23 pass attempts. I can't really articulate how low that is in terms of an individual game for pass volume, but 23 or lower pass attempts for a starting quarterback in a game is basement. It's below the floor.
It's the type of protection of the QB that you would also see with guys like Anthony Richardson, where like we just simply can't let him throw very much.
Yeah, it's through the floor was the phrase that we're using. So the whole game plan is built around his athleticism and his ability to run, and the running game off of that, a multifaceted run game, which is what LaFleur did so well for Willis. I've made the case that LaFleur also has helped Jordan Love's per attempt and per dropback numbers by running the ball as much as he has, and that there are teams in the NFL, because defenses have gotten so good, that are running more than you would say was optimal, but it's actually working when you have a limited QB. And the Seahawks are exhibit A. They won with Sam Darnold because they did that. They were willing to, even when they were leading, run way more like a PROE that was significantly negative. And Darnold still led the league in giveaways. And this is why, like, people who are like, oh, Sam Darnold's good now. How do you lead the league in giveaways when your team's constantly in plus script and you have a negative PROE relative to that? Your coach is constantly like, we're going to run on every second and third and long and then punt and then play defense because we're afraid that you're going to make a back-breaking mistake that's going to cost us this game, and you still lead the league in giveaways, and people are like, he's good now. I mean, it's just, there's all the stats about obvious and not, and I'm not saying Darnold's bad, I want to be clear, but there's all the stats about obvious and non-obvious passing downs, and when you have to drop back and throw into actual pass coverages, how difficult that can be. It's one of the things about Lamar Jackson's career, for example, that people have always said is when they trail and in the postseason, he's had to throw into tougher pass looks as opposed to when they're leading and they're so multifaceted and dynamic with some of their ground game stuff that they're throwing off of that it creates different challenges. I'm not saying Lamar Jackson is limited. I want to be very clear. I think he's the ceiling is higher than anyone in the league almost with this guy, but the ways that the volume of pass and the run pass split leads to per attempt and per dropback efficiency is super relevant. And it doesn't mean that the quarterback is that amazing when they're only throwing in non-obvious spots and the team is like waving the white flag on series. Again, we talk about football as a game of possessions, and teams are running the ball, giving up possessions as opposed to dropping back when it should be an obvious pass down and then punting and then trying to win by playing defense, because defenses are winning. You can still win that way because offenses aren't so much better. Like 10 years ago, we thought that was stupid because offenses scored at such a high rate and were so efficient that you're bound to lose. The percentages were not going to work in your way if you're just giving up possessions. I think the modern NFL to a degree says if you do have a limited quarterback, you can give up some possessions and still win. But anyway, I brought up the Jordan Love thing. I don't think he's as limited, and I think it's telling that LaFleur still dropped back a lot more with Love, right? He still did some limiting stuff and they ran the ball a lot, but Love threw significantly more than Willis. When Willis came in, we went further down that road. We needed to limit things even more. So I don't know what to think of Willis. I think it's very telling that he has not thrown more than 23 passes in a game in his career relative to the fact that some team's going to pay him. It's like we keep hearing 20 or 30 million. Whenever you hear that, it tends to be towards the high end. I would say at least 25 million probably per year is what we're going to wind up at. That's a lot of money to give a guy who's never thrown 23 passes or more than 23 passes in a game. That's never thrown 25, 30 passes. We've never had to see him drop back in the fourth quarter of a game where he's down by 7 against pass defenses and lead a scoring drive in that spot. That's the type of stuff that Matthew Stafford, this year's MVP, has done well throughout his entire career. You have to drop back in a key spot late and he'll go and do it. And that is what you have to be able to do in the modern NFL. It's what Patrick Mahomes has been able to do. The Chiefs constantly lead the league in PROE and are more pass heavy than their game script would dictate. And then people hammer Mahomes because his ADOT falls and his per attempt efficiency and per dropback efficiency fall, and don't understand that the context of the weight of his overall pass attempts and dropbacks of obvious passing downs versus non-obvious passing downs, it skews toward obvious passing downs relative to somebody like Malik Willis, where that's not to say Malik Willis is bad. The per attempt efficiency Malik Willis is insane, but it's insane because of this. So we just have to contextualize the players as different. It can't be made as an apples to apples comparison. That's sort of my whole response of Malik Willis. As far as Taylon Green, you were talking about how he could play at the next level. It's a very interesting question to me when you started talking about him never actually being particularly good in college, and I pulled up his numbers as I was talking. He played at 2 different colleges, Boise State first, then Arkansas. He had more than 200 attempts in 4 seasons, 2 for each team. He never completed more than 61.3% of his passes, right? Like there's some real he never threw for more than 3,154 yards. It's not like he's had some really strong passing numbers at the college level. It's tough for me to see how that's going to translate to the NFL level. But like you said, maybe he develops. Willis had pretty good passing numbers at Liberty, right? As I recall.
He had some interesting numbers and also made the athletic types of plays. Now, one of the things that I would note here is that going in and looking at the QBs from a rushing perspective, because we are interested in what they will do fantasy-wise. If you did get a start, what would that mean? One of the reasons that Mendoza is, not the top pick in this class is he doesn't have enough of a hybrid profile to make him competitive with a Jeremiah Love. Green was very impressive as a runner. And so you would have enthusiasm about what he could do if he played, but there's probably just not a realistic path to where you would play in a time frame that managers in all but the deepest of dynasty leagues could hold you to that point.
But that's a fun note. I scroll down on this page now that you say that 8+ rushing TDs, all 4 of those seasons I mentioned where he had 200+ dropbacks, at least 400 rushing yards every year. 3 of them are 588 rushing yards or more. That's a lot for a quarterback, and obviously the touchdowns to go with it. You mentioned the athleticism that's going to play up in the red zone and those things. So certainly a high ceiling player if he ever does get in. It's even just something to put in the back of your mind after where we learn that he lands and we're in season. If the starter gets hurt and there's a potential that he's going to start some games, like you said, that's how Malik Willis ultimately got to where he is. Do you want to pick him up? Well, we're kind of saying, yeah, like Taylor Green would be a fun dude to at least stream if you knew that he was going to make a start at the NFL level at some point in the next few years. But let's talk about Mendoza, because I did just blow past that. Do you think he's worth you? So you got Jeremiah Love as the 101, but do you think Mendoza is, as a prospect, you said that some of the things that our guy Travis has learned about the quarterback position suggests that Mendoza is a legit prospect. I've seen some things going both ways, and that's always the case with high-end quarterbacks, especially in a class like this where he's not up there. I saw some people suggesting that he wouldn't have been, that there are NFL people that are saying he wouldn't have been the top pick even last year with Cam Ward, and if you go back a couple of years, he would have been behind, the 2024 class, he would have been behind all of, Caleb and Jane Daniels and Drake May, and even I think I saw Bo Nix thrown in there.
People really are pulling the revisionist
on Bo
Nix. Huh?
Yeah, Bo Nix is in that tier now with a lot of people. It's fantastic. But yeah, because Penix and McCarthy obviously both went before Nix even, but I don't think they get pulled into that, but Nix does. But anyway, Mendoza would be behind the top group in that year as well. Is that how you see it, or do you see him as a really actually pretty interesting? Like, is he a 101 because it's a down year, or is he actually a legitimately pretty interesting 101?
I think he's a pretty interesting top pick in the NFL draft. I think because you have such a weak next group of players, the fact that I think there's a pretty clear wide receiver 1, and as you were mentioning, many other very sharp, rookie draft and dynasty specific analysts have him as the wide receiver 2 or the wide receiver 3, which I think you have to have a lot of respect for the people who that's basically their thing. And they're saying he's not that guy. If we're kind of in that mix with those receivers, I think that, even though we had kind of this argument last year with Cam Ward, where when we did our mocks and we did our NFL Draft Live show and all of that, and we had Ward well down, part of that was because there were so many interesting players that you could fill in between and say, well, Ward doesn't have the scoring profile that would justify taking him at the top, even in Superflex. And I think that the opposite case might be made this year, where Mendoza becomes a safer selection, in part because you don't have other clear names, and because in Superflex, the quarterback who goes on to have a 10, 15-year career. And one of the things that I'm thinking of here as well is that I've got a lot more confidence that this current Raiders team, with the coaching change, a team that has a Genti that you can rely on, that has a Brock Bowers, where even though that's a tight end, you have one of the best players in the entire NFL as pieces that you can rely on. Whereas you think about Cam Ward and what the Titans try to do with basically no coaching and no players around him, I think we're going to see a very different type of thing. When you cut out Mendoza's numbers and you look at the scheme adjusted type of thing that Travis was discussing, where you're not looking at play action, you're not looking at jet motion plays, you're filtering out all of the underneath throws. So when I was looking at this, I'm looking at a dot of 6 or more. His IQR is up in the 133 range, which would be commensurate with the names that you had discussed. And the players that we tend to, not to say that they can't hit, because quarterbacks can hit, right? But to say that there's a lot more risk. I mean, you're talking with guys with IQRs down around 100, or in some cases 85, with like a Will Levis, or like in the 60s with an Anthony Richardson. And then you kind of cut the things up and look at the deep passing numbers are there. He massively separates from everyone else in the class and is more like some of these previous top picks. You look at the third and four or longer types of opportunities where you have to make a play to keep the drive going. He looks good in those environments. Quarterbacks can always miss too, right? So it's kind of the thing where quarterbacks with bad numbers like a Tyler Shook can go out there and play relatively well in spurts and maybe hit for good. Quarterbacks with very good profiles can miss, but when we're talking about what the ranges are, I feel pretty good about Mendoza. And then quarterback is the ultimate leadership position. And if you are leading a team, I think especially a program like Indiana, now maybe you say, well, the head coach is the one who really changed everything and made Indiana this juggernaut. But despite having a number of 5-star recruits that is nothing compared to all previous national champions, that it's the coach who did all of that. The coach obviously deserves an immense amount of credit. When we're talking about a guy going and winning a national championship, I don't think that we can ignore that either.
Yeah, absolutely. That's good stuff. I said we'd do the quarterbacks quick, and then I mostly made that long. But we should run to the tight ends because and that kind of leaves Ty Simpson out, but I don't think he's that interesting. Run to the tight ends. Kenyon Sadiq is a name that you mentioned to me pre-show is interesting. Or maybe you mentioned on the show. We were going to have a quick show today. We're already at an hour and a half. Eli Stowers is another one that you have reasonably well ranked. I'm looking at their profiles a little bit. Sadiq, a 3-year guy from Oregon, 8 touchdowns last year, but maxed out at 560 yards. Not like massive production like I would want to see from the first like just raw numbers that I'm looking at. Stowers, a guy who played at 3 different colleges, didn't ever get on the field at Texas A&M, went to New Mexico State, then went to Vanderbilt, had some good numbers at Vanderbilt the last couple years, but at an advanced age. Obviously, if you're going to be a 5-year college player, what is it about these two that translates beyond what I'm seeing as underwhelming raw tight end? I mean, we have to control for the fact that they are tight ends, but underwhelming raw numbers.
So the Stowers one I think is fascinating. The end of the blurb that Blair has for him in the Freak Score write-up talks about how he's almost 2 years older than Sadiq, having transferred to Vanderbilt after 2 years of playing quarterback at Texas A&M and a year playing both quarterback and tight end at New Mexico State. And so then there's this question of, well, how much do we want to like either give credit for or discount, or how are we going to play with the age thing if this guy just is like, well, I failed as a QB, I am pretty athletic, let's go try something else. The thing that jumps out to me, now Stowers in terms of the per route stuff this last year was pretty good, not necessarily sensational like a Bowers or a Tyler Warren, but very good. You go in, and I think it's interesting because we pull up the last 3 seasons, all college tight ends with at least 50 targets, and we look at points above average per route. Eli Stowers 2024 is number 1. Harold Fannon's 2024 is number 2, and Stowers 2025 is number 5. And so again, I'm not saying that is the number that we should really be anchoring to, but I do think it's fascinating that for someone like a Stowers, or maybe you're trying to think, well, how good is this guy? How meaningful were his production numbers within the context of what Vanderbilt was doing? How much of it was on him? And SIS is saying a lot of it was on him. He was very, very good. He was better than some of the guys like Bowers and Warren and what have you in that one particular stat. And the reason that you might look all of that stuff up and be intrigued by it is because Eli Stowers is 239 pounds. And Ben, he ran a 4.51 40-yard dash, which not only is, quite obviously faster than what Carnell Tate ran, but is blazing for a tight end. And he set the all-time vertical leap record at 45 and a half inches.
Is that good?
45 and a half inches.
That's crazy. Okay. And so I'm actually seeing on some other lists where he's looked at as like the tight end 3. So maybe he's climbing right now. That Max Clare from Ohio State ranked second for some people here. That combine, I assume, is pretty huge for Stowers. The key point would be, to your point, if he was playing quarterback early, the fact that he was able to go over 600 receiving yards the last 2 years in the SEC for Vanderbilt, pretty interesting. 111 total catches over those 2 seasons, 49 and then 62. Those aren't huge numbers, but for a tight end in college football, they're not nothing. And then you talk about that athleticism, and you talk about an NFL that's moving toward more 12 and 13 and wants these type of athletic tight ends because they can force defenses out of nickel into base, and then they can use these guys as more like wide receivers. I wonder if he'd ever get the full routes, if he's a full tight end to be able to play on all the downs, or if he would just be like a sub package guy at the next level.
You get the concern that he could be a little bit of a tweener or a little bit of a catch only tight end. And if teams are going in this direction of doing the type of thing that we saw last year, obviously from the Rams, for example, if we're going to have teams say, well, look, we want him to be a true tight end if we're going to use this draft capital on him and we're going to play him on all of these snaps, I think the counter would simply be that you don't get that many opportunities to put a football player on the field who is so athletically superior to other NFL players that if you're going to pass on that, and especially if you're not going to have to use a first-round pick in the reality draft, can you afford to pass that up? We're talking about someone who had over 100 rushing yards in that season with New Mexico State. We're talking about a player who in that first year at Vanderbilt actually had a 26% dominator, which is extraordinary for a tight end. We're talking about a guy who just went back-to-back seasons with over 2 yards per team attempt. The receiving upside for Stowers seems extremely compelling.
Yeah, it's fun. I was thinking, as I was talking about maybe the limitations of playing time and stuff, I was thinking of maybe like Dalton Kincaid's year this year where he was efficient, but we didn't get enough routes necessarily. But there are other, you can go up to like what Tucker Kraft was doing. And people were often saying Tucker Kraft was sort of limited in some ways, or isn't like a huge I guess he was running a decent number of routes. Maybe he's not the right example. Maybe he's more of a 3-down tight end than I'm giving him credit for, but he wasn't getting a ton of catches, and it was the efficiency that was really driving it for him. If you're super athletic and you can score a bunch of touchdowns and make big plays at the tight end position, it can score in fantasy, certainly.
Well, and you think about Fannin a year ago, and there are certainly some differences. The guy is not as athletic and played at Bowling Green and all that, and also had just these insane production numbers.
Yeah, isn't he like
basically? Well, but the concern is that he's going to be a tweener, right? The concern is that you're just not going to be on the field enough. And if someone like a Fannin who is Fannin, I think, is an underrated athlete. I was mentioning the tracking, like at the Senior Bowl stuff, had actually been very positive on him. So I didn't think that the combine really reflected how athletic he probably was. But if you are a non-power conference player who doesn't test as a superstar athlete, and you still just right away are like, yeah, I'm going to put up huge numbers because I was a good player and I'm a good receiver, and having a matchup problem at the tight end position, even if it's not on full snaps, that helps. That's a weapon for your team. someone like Stowers, it should be maybe less of a concern because you had numbers against big time teams and just your athleticism again. I mean, Ben, a 240-pound man who jumped 45.5 inches. I mean, you're always open, right? Unless you're just terrible from a skill perspective, you're always open. And we know that Stowers put up numbers. I think he's undervalued. He's a very fun guy.
You're definitely getting me interested. The Fannin point I was going to say isn't the exact opposite because he's a guy who produced and all this stuff. But your point was the concern was that he may not play enough snaps, and yet he did at the NFL level. The team that went and selected him said, we're going to use him a lot. We're going to use him even more than David Njoku. And now David Njoku's on his way out the door, and they're like, don't let the door hit you on the way out. They don't seem to care about that. They are ready to move forward with Harold Fannin. They think he's exceptional. If he lands Stowers in a position on a team that feels about him that same way, I was thinking about some other position change guys, I guess, is why these names came to mind for me. But Juwan Johnson was always somewhat rotational, felt like he would never get all the routes. He finally did last year. And then he was one of 8 tight ends who had 100 targets. He was 5th at the position in catches. And because he's athletic, because he's a former wide receiver, he was 3rd at the position in yards, even though he was like 8th in targets, because he's efficient. He's a good, athletic, dynamic player. He only had 3 touchdowns, why people are probably a little bit down on Juwan Johnson. I saw his early ADP, and I was like, that's wrong. Like, he's got to go higher than that. This guy was 3rd at the position behind only Trey McBride and Kyle Pitts in receiving yardage last year. The other one that came to mind, another converted QB, was Logan Thomas. And for a long time, it was like Logan Thomas isn't going to run all the routes and play the position. He can't block. He's a converted quarterback. He's never even played tight end. Took him some time, but he's got a big frame. And the Washington football team at the time decided to use him as a tight end and in a full-time role, and he had like a tight end 3 season. He had like a really good season. It wasn't like a absolute elite ceiling, but the point is we have a very limited number, a sample of tight ends, period, full stop. Players that have even played this position in history. Every player is unique at every position. We talk about this with different running backs and different receivers. We should never limit our imagination of what a guy can be based on just like what other guys like him looked like when we're searching for outliers. And as you've pointed out, he set the combine record in the vert. He already is an athletic outlier. This is something that could be like Logan Thomas with more athleticism or Juwan Johnson in a different type of way. Like, we're not limited to comps, but there are comps of players that were thought to be limited in terms of the number of play. I was being too quick to put him in a box and say he's not going to play every snap at the next level. There's a lot of examples beyond the Fannin one. The Fannin one's a great one, but I was just mentioning some more of players that people thought would be limited in terms of the overall volume at the next level. They weren't 3-down tight ends and those types of things. Evan Ingram's another one that comes to mind. People would say that about a lot. Couldn't block well enough, undersized, one of the smallest tight ends coming out in history. I remember he was just so small. Yeah, he's super athletic, but he's too small. And he ends up, he's not had an amazing career, but he ends up having a year where he, I believe at the time, set the tight end receptions record, if I'm not mistaken, had like 114 catches a couple years ago for Jacksonville. So like you can have every down volume. You can compile. His issue is that he's not efficient enough despite the athleticism, oddly enough with him, which just gets back to every player being unique. Their actual traits don't actually play the way that you'd expect them to in their profile and yada, yada, yada. So Stowers, fun dude, interesting dude. I loved learning about that, the quarterback background. What about Sadiq, the 3 years at Oregon? You have him ranked pretty aggressively, and people who are looking at the RotoViz guide will that's a little tease for you that Sadiq's somebody that Shawn is pretty stoked about. So what are you seeing there?
Well, this is basically Vernon Davis plus, right? And
okay.
The concern would basically be that Vernon Davis was a better reality player than fantasy weapon. And I think when you look at Sadiq, you're like, man, with these athletic qualities, why was he not even better? We'll get to that in a moment. I want to read you Blair's first sentence here because it really emphasizes kind of where he is athletically. Sadiq is one of only 2 players in the database at any position with a speed score of at least 130 and an explosion score above 170. The other is Calvin Johnson.
Okay, so we should be high on these really athletic players at a position where teams are looking to get more of them on the field and utilize their mismatch ability against base defenses. I guess that makes a lot of sense.
This dude is 241 pounds, right? And I think if you saw Stowers perform, I mean, you've got to be disappointed that he only jumped 43 and a half inches. But then
these are tight ends. These are aliens.
A 4.39 40.
What? Sadiq ran a 4.39. I guess I wasn't paying attention. I'm not. I think I say this pretty much every year, but I'm not like I see a lot of people on Twitter and stuff that are, they watch every minute of the combine. I'm not a plug into every minute of the combine. I'm a plug into every minute of the games that matter. But I missed that. A tight end at 240 plus who ran a 4.39.
4.39 40. So, I mean, I think you have to make the argument, and he's going to be 21 years old.
240.
Yeah, 4.39 40. That's 43 and a half inch vertical.
That's Derrick Henry. Did Derrick Henry run a?
No, like in the 4.5s.
He was in like the 4.5s, but he's that size. He's as big as Derrick Henry, but even faster. Holy shit.
So you have to make the argument that he can't play football at all to not take him in the top 10. I was kind of blown away that he had that combine and he's still being projected sort of outside the top half of the first round by a lot of folks. Now, these are people who know a lot more about the draft than I do. And so I say that in some ways just kind of marveling for myself, right? His final and best season, a little under 1.4 yards per team attempt. Brock Bowers, for example, multiple seasons above 2. I mean, these are not extraordinary production numbers. And yet you're talking about that athleticism, and you're talking about a guy who will be 21 years old and had 560 yards for Oregon last year and scored 8 touchdowns. That's not in the range of red flags for saying this guy can't play. You're like, if a guy did that at 20 for your college, scores the 8 touchdowns, and is superhuman, and is going to offer you some flexibility with blocking as well. In the current NFL, I mean, how do these teams in this sort of like 6 through 15 range pass on that? I mean, you're guaranteed to draft someone less athletic. At least that part is for sure.
Yeah, and like you said, in the current NFL, I mean, so much of it right now is about the scheme, is about the mismatches. You see the very best teams going after the freak athletes and understanding that some of the I mean, you want the great producers too. We've known that for a long time. But when you get athletic players, you said you don't get a lot of opportunities to draft players that are great athletes, even by NFL standards, relative to the other NFL players. And historically, those guys have tended to succeed at the next level in a huger. I mean, there's stuff about certainly at the tight end position, you have to hit a certain level of athleticism, and I know people have shown the very best tight ends have all been at least a certain number of athleticism. People looking at the relative athletic score and a certain RAS and above, and there's basically no hits that are below it. And see that stuff at I know in offensive defensive line that there are specific athletic stuff that it's like, I mean, you want really athletic players. It's important, even though it's important to also be skilled at the game as well. But these elite athleticism guys do stand out. Cool. Anything else? What about that Max Clare guy? Is he just not? I mean, obviously played at Ohio State this past year alongside both Jeremiah Smith and Carnell Tate. Played at Purdue for 3 years prior to that. Is he not somebody that's very interesting to you? I see you have him a little further down your list.
Yeah, we were looking at that 2024 season where he goes over 2 yards per team attempt. He has a 30% dominator. As a tight end, those are really, really impressive numbers. Can he match these other guys in some other areas? Probably not, but certainly in a weak draft, if he goes early into a team where there's going to be some opportunity there, if it seems like the team itself is enthusiastic about him, yeah, I think that there's plenty of possibility.
Cool. This was a fun exercise to kind of get to know the class. It's not a super high upside class, but it's interesting. I feel like I learned an absolute ton because I haven't done a lot of digging in this yet. I thought it would be fun to have this conversation with you. You've been hard at work. To all the listeners, make sure you get out and get the RotoViz rookie guide. Blair's been hard at work. Kevin's been hard at work. The rookie guide's awesome. Gets you a ton of great information about all these guys. For me, I enjoyed talking with you and getting the high level stuff about all these guys. And I mean, a lot of the nuance as well. I feel like I learned an absolute ton about the class. Hopefully the listeners feel the same way. Obviously, the rookies, big part of what we like to do here at Stealing Bananas will be something we talk about a lot more throughout the offseason. But yeah, that's what we're looking at.
Yeah, it's fun. Looking forward to what we do with our team, to all of those rookie drafts, to the NFL draft itself. Then this is one of the most fun times of year. We've got free agency coming up. That will obviously inform a lot of the more near-term thoughts on how people draft and put their teams together. What do folks who are subscribed over at Stealing Signals have to look forward to? I know you were hard at work even before we started recording this morning.
Well, yeah, I'm still finishing up the field tippers piece. We talked about that recently. It's been a couple weeks now since I finished the AFC side. I'm more than halfway done with the NFC side, but I have not gotten that out, in part because I did a little bit of travel and then got sick coming off of that, and it's just lingered and been annoying. And anyway, that will be coming. I've already written 7. I was looking back, Sean. I wrote 7 macro level posts between the end of the football season, the start of January, and into February about the different themes from the season, about quarterback play, about scheme being more important than ever, about the things that happened at the different positions in terms of scoring and where the league is going. It was over 30,000 words. I'm not always efficient with my words, as listeners know, but there's a lot of words of analysis in there as well. So a ton of stuff up that builds off of, the in-season research from Stealing Signals. I like to do a lot of deep dives early in the offseason where all that really important contextual stuff that gets lost, I think, throughout the offseason is fresh in my mind that I can put into the deep dives. And then I end up referring back to it later in the year when I do my projections and stuff, but really just wanting to summarize. And this offseason is so interesting because of where we're at, because of the parity and the futures odds and all these things that we've talked about. The league is shifting. I think it's really important to understand that fantasy football analysis going into 2026 is not just about player profiles, but about understanding the sport. I have a lot of that stuff up over at Stealing Signals, and then the player stuff is what I dove into. That's what the field tipper stuff is. Got half the league. The other half is coming. If not in the next couple of days, then it would be next week. But hopefully in the next couple of days, I'll get that finished up and sent out. I've had just a bunch of things to do, but yeah, a lot out there, a lot of content. I've already basically written a draft kit for 2026. So it's there for the subscribers.
That's awesome. That's awesome. I think that the biggest exploitable opportunity as a fantasy drafter is to actually have some patience and fully calibrate on the previous year. We have such an amazing overall, larger fantasy community, and the analysis of news and things that happen. I mean, it's so fast paced that mistakes can be made, but there's so much information there. People do such a great job with it. But if you don't have the right baselines, if you're not calibrated on what happened in the previous season and how football is working as a whole, you don't know how to really, for your own drafts and for your own rankings, you don't know how all of the news pieces that are coming at you so fast and furious should affect where people move from, because you don't have the right beginning spot. Make sure you check out Stealing Signals. We'd love to have you guys over at RotoViz. Rookie Guide. A lot of fun. This has been a blast. We love you guys. We'll talk to you soon.